Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the most unlikely places. When you've spent years believing you're beyond redemption, a stranger's desperate need can become your unexpected path to grace. In the frozen wilderness of Montana Territory, mountain man Silas Crowley discovers a paralyzed bride abandoned in the snow. He takes her in, thinking he's simply saving a life. But Lila May knows things about his past that should have died decades ago. She speaks names that were buried long ago. As winter closes around his remote cabin, Silas realizes this broken woman might be connected to his darkest secret. This is a story about how our past never stays buried, and how sometimes our greatest fear arrives wearing the face of salvation. What terrible secret is Lila May hiding that could destroy everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine ridges like the breath of sleeping giants, and Silas Crowley moved through it with the practiced silence of a man who had learned to live without disturbing the peace. At 58, his weathered hands still held steady as he checked the trap lines that kept him fed through the harsh Montana winters. His beard, more silver than brown now, caught the early frost that painted everything in his small corner of the world with crystalline beauty. Boone padded beside him, the husky's thick coat steaming in the cold air. The dog had been his only companion for 7 years now, ever since he'd found the half-starved pup abandoned near the trading post in Bitter Creek. They understood each other in the way that lonely souls often do, without need for words, with patience for each other's moods, and with the kind of loyalty that comes from choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, its log walls chinked tight against the mountain cold. Silas had built it with his own hands 12 years ago, when he'd first fled to these heights with nothing but guilt and a desperate need for solitude. The structure spoke of a man who understood both permanence and practicality. Thick walls, a stone fireplace that could heat the whole space, and windows positioned to catch the morning light while offering clear views of anyone approaching from below. Inside, the single room held the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned to live simply. Hand-carved furniture built to last, shelves lined with preserves, dried meat, and the few books he read by firelight during the long winter nights. A bed in one corner, a kitchen table that served for eating, writing, and the occasional medical work he did on injured animals. Everything had its place, everything served a purpose. It was the home of a man who had pared his life down to its essentials, but it was the leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling, that told the real story of Silas Crowley. Hidden beneath loose floorboards near his bed, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep the mountain dampness at bay, it contained 30 years of entries, written in a careful, educated hand. The early pages told of a young sheriff full of righteous purpose. The middle sections revealed the slow erosion of certainty that comes with seeing too much of what people do to each other. And the later entries, well, those spoke of a specific night that had ended everything he thought he knew about justice, duty, and his own moral compass. March 15th, 1863. Received word today that the Hartwell case files have been officially closed. 30 years, and they're calling it resolved. How do you resolve the death of innocence? How do you file away the screams of children who trusted you to protect them? Some things should never be closed, never forgotten. Some sins follow a man no matter how far he runs. The entry was typical of the later pages, full of remorse, self-recrimination, and the kind of pain that doesn't fade with time, but rather settles into a man's bones like winter cold. Silas had been sheriff of Bitter Creek County for 15 years when everything went wrong. A simple arrest warrant, a family accused of harboring outlaws, a house that caught fire in the struggle. When the smoke cleared, 3 children lay dead, and their parents had died trying to save them. The outlaws they'd supposedly been hiding were found 2 counties over, having never been near the Hartwell farm. The newspapers had called it a tragic mistake. The territorial government had called it an unfortunate incident. Silas had called it the end of everything he believed about himself. He turned in his badge the next morning and walked into the mountains, carrying nothing but the weight of what he'd done. Now, as he made his way back toward the cabin with 2 fat rabbits and a satisfied dog, Silas allowed himself to think that perhaps he'd found a kind of peace in this exile. The mountains didn't judge. The animals he trapped died quick, clean deaths for a purpose, to keep him alive. There was an honesty in that transaction that had been missing from his life for too long. Boone suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward, and let out a low whine. Silas followed the dog's gaze and felt his blood chill. Smoke was rising from the direction of his cabin, not the thin, steady stream from his fireplace, but thick. Dark billows that spoke of something burning that shouldn't be. They ran then, man and dog racing through the pines with a speed that belied Silas's years. As they crested the last ridge before the clearing, he could see his cabin was intact. But something else was burning, a pile of debris near the tree line, sending up the smoke that had alarmed them. It wasn't debris. Silas dropped to one knee beside the smoldering remains of what had once been an elegant wheelchair. The metal frame was twisted from heat, but he could still make out the intricate scrollwork that spoke of expensive craftsmanship. Scattered around it were pieces of white fabric, silk and lace that had been torn and stained with something dark that might have been blood. "What in the hell?" he whispered, and Boone pressed against his leg with another whine. That's when he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it beneath the crackling of dying embers. A moan, human and female, coming from the direction of the pine grove. Silas grabbed his rifle from where he'd dropped it and moved cautiously toward the sound. She was propped against the base of a massive pine, her dark hair matted with snow and blood, wearing the remnants of what had once been a wedding dress. The gown was torn and mud-stained, revealing glimpses of pale skin, marked with bruises. But it was her eyes that stopped him, wide, dark, and filled with an intelligence that seemed to catalogue his every movement. "Miss?" Silas approached slowly, the way he would a wounded animal. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her left hand clutched something small and metallic, a delicate gold ring that caught the weak sunlight filtering through the pine boughs. The ring bore an inscription he couldn't quite make out, but something about it seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with old memories. "I'm gonna help you," he said, setting down his rifle and shrugging out of his heavy coat. "My name's Silas. What's yours?" "Lila," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Lila May." As he wrapped his coat around her shivering form, Silas noticed something that would haunt him in the days to come. When she looked at him, truly looked at him, there was recognition in her eyes. Not the vague awareness of an injured woman seeing her rescuer, but the specific recognition of someone who knew exactly who he was. "Do we know each other, Miss Lila May?" he asked gently. She closed her eyes and didn't answer, but her grip tightened on the gold ring. And Silas could swear he heard her whisper a name that made his blood run cold. Hartwell. The name hung in the mountain air like the echo of an old gunshot, and Silas understood that his peaceful exile was about to come to an end. As he lifted the broken woman in his arms and carried her toward his cabin, Boone trailing behind with worried eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no chance encounter. The past, it seemed, had finally tracked him down. The cabin felt different with another person in it, smaller somehow, but also more alive. As Silas laid Lila May on his bed and began the careful work of assessing her injuries, he found himself moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen violence and its aftermath. Her legs showed no response to gentle pressure. Paralyzed, he realized, though whether from recent injury or long-standing condition, he couldn't tell. The wedding dress told its own story. Expensive silk and French lace, now ruined by whatever ordeal had brought her to his mountain. The bodice was torn, revealing more bruises across her ribs. Her wrists bore marks that looked suspiciously like rope burns. This woman had suffered, and recently, but it was when he was cleaning the blood from a cut on her forehead that she opened her eyes again and spoke words that would change everything. "You kept my father's letters," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on a point across the room where nothing sat but empty air. "All these years, you kept them, but you never opened them." Silas's hands stilled. In the corner where she was looking, hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace, sat a bundle of letters he'd been receiving for decades. Letters with the Hartwell family lawyer's return address that he'd never had the courage to open. Letters that no one else knew about. "How could you possibly know that?" he whispered. Lila May's eyes found his, and in them he saw something that was part accusation, a part forgiveness, and wholly terrifying. "Because," she said, "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Sheriff Crowley, outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin windows like fingers tapping against glass. Boone whined and settled himself beside the bed, as if he too understood that their quiet life was over. Winter was coming early this year, and with it, the reckoning Silas had been running from for 30 years. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to carry all the weight of past mistakes and the promise of consequences finally come due. The broken wheelchair lay in pieces beside the cabin's front steps, its ornate metalwork twisted and scarred as if it had tumbled down a mountainside. Silas examined the wreckage in the pale morning light, running his weathered fingers along brass fittings that spoke of wealth and careful craftsmanship. This wasn't some simple conveyance. It was a custom piece, built for someone with means and particular needs. "Hand-forged in Philadelphia," he murmured to himself, recognizing the maker's mark on one of the larger pieces. "Cost more than most folks see in a year." Boone sniffed at the debris with intense curiosity, his hackles rising as he caught scents that Silas couldn't detect. The dog had been agitated since they'd brought Lila May inside, pacing between the bed where she slept and the door, as if he expected either rescue or trouble to arrive at any moment. Inside the cabin, Lila May had drifted in and out of consciousness through the night. Silas had done what he could, cleaned her wounds, checked for broken bones, wrapped her in warm blankets and positioned her near the fire. She was stronger than she looked, he'd give her that. Most folks wouldn't have survived a night in the mountains wearing nothing but a torn wedding dress. But every time she woke, even for brief moments, she said things that made his skin crawl with their impossible accuracy. "You built this place in 1851, she'd whispered during one lucid spell, "after you burned the letters from the territorial governor, the ones offering you a position in Helena." Silas had never told another living soul about those letters. He'd burned them himself, alone, on a night when the guilt had been eating him alive, and any reminder of his former life felt like a knife twist. Now, as he gathered the wheelchair pieces to store them in his shed, he tried to make sense of what he was dealing with. The woman claimed her name was Lila May, and she'd spoken the Hartwell name like it meant something personal. But the Hartwells had all died in that fire 30 years ago. He'd watched their house burn, heard their screams, carried their bodies out himself, unless... The thought struck him like a physical blow. There had been talk in the chaotic aftermath of a baby who'd been sent away to relatives back east before the tragedy. A daughter, born to the Hartwells' eldest son and his young wife. Silas had dismissed it as gossip at the time, too consumed with his own guilt to investigate further. But if that baby had lived, I'd grown up knowing the story of what happened to her family. "You're thinking about little Sarah," Lila May's voice came from the doorway, weak but clear. Silas spun around to find her wrapped in one of his blankets, leaning heavily against the doorframe. Without her wheelchair, she was forced to support herself on her arms, her useless legs dragging behind her. "You shouldn't be up," he said, moving quickly to help her. "You need rest." Sarah Hartwell, she continued, ignoring his concern. Born April 3rd, 1833, sent to live with her mother's sister in Baltimore after her parents were killed. "That's who you're thinking about, isn't it?" Silas's mouth went dry. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Sarah Hartwell grew up to be Sarah Blackwood, and Sarah Blackwood became Sarah Whitmore when she married a Boston banker. Lila May's dark eyes fixed on his with uncomfortable intensity. And yesterday morning, Sarah Whitmore was supposed to become Sarah Brennan at a wedding in Missoula. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. You're her. You're Sarah Hartwell. I was. Her voice carried 30 years of carefully controlled pain. But Sarah Hartwell died in a fire set by a sheriff who was too eager to prove himself. I've been Lila May for most of my life. Silas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The baby who'd been sent away, who'd grown up an orphan because of his mistake, was sitting in his cabin looking at him with eyes that held decades of planned revenge. The broken wheelchair, the wedding dress, her presence in these remote mountains, none of it was coincidence. The wedding, he said slowly. You ran from your own wedding to come here. I've been planning this for 20 years, she admitted, her grip tightening on the blanket. Ever since I learned the truth about what really happened that night. About how Sheriff Silas Crowley shot first and asked questions later. About how my family died because you were afraid of outlaws who weren't even there. The accusation hit him like a physical blow. All the more painful because it was true. He had been afraid that night. Young, inexperienced, facing his first real test as a lawman. When someone had moved in the shadows of the Hartwell house, he'd drawn his gun and fired. The muzzle flash had ignited some spilled lamp oil, and within minutes the whole place was ablaze. I've lived with that guilt every day for 30 years, he said quietly. It's why I came up here. Why I'll never go back down. Guilt isn't enough. Her voice was steady, matter of fact. Guilt doesn't bring back the dead. Guilt doesn't give me back my family. Boone whined and pressed against Silas's leg, sensing the tension in the room. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, promising the kind of early winter weather that could trap them in the cabin for weeks. So what is this? Silas asked. You came here to kill me, to make me suffer. For the first time since he'd found her, Lila May's composure cracked slightly. I don't know, she admitted. I thought I knew. I had it all planned. Find you, confront you, make you face what you'd done. But now, she looked around the cabin, taking in the simple furniture, the careful repairs, the evidence of a man who'd built a life out of nothing but his own labor. This isn't what I expected. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? A coward. A man who ran because he was afraid of consequences, not because he was destroyed by what he'd done. She shifted position, wincing as her injured ribs protested. The letters my family's lawyer sent you, they weren't threats or demands for justice. They were updates about me, about how I was growing up, what I was learning, whether I was happy. Silas stared at her. I never opened them. I know, he told me. Said you returned everyone unopened with deceased, returned to sender, written on the envelope. Her laugh was bitter. For 30 years, you've been dead to the world. But not to me, never to me. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending a shower of pine needles against the glass. Snow was starting to fall, big heavy flakes that spoke of a serious storm coming. The wheelchair, Silas said, finally asking the question that had been bothering him. How did it get broken? Lila May's face went pale. I fell. During the storm yesterday, I was trying to get closer to the cabin and the wheel caught on something. I tumbled down the slope. It was a lie. Silas had seen enough injuries to know the difference between accident and violence. The marks on her wrists, the bruises on her ribs, the way she flinched from sudden movements. Someone had hurt her. And recently. Who were you running from, Miss Lila May? He asked gently. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. My husband, my brand new husband, who decided that marrying a cripple entitled him to certain freedoms. Who thought that because I couldn't run, I couldn't fight back. The rage that filled Silas was swift and fierce, the same protective anger that had once made him a good sheriff before fear and inexperience had corrupted his judgment. He hurt you, he tried to. Her voice was stronger now, defiant. But I may be paralyzed, but I'm not helpless. I had a gun in my wedding bouquet. When he came at me, I used it. Is he dead? I don't know. I didn't stay to find out. She looked out the window at the swirling snow. But if he is alive, he'll come looking for me. And if he's dead, others will come looking for his killer. Silas understood now why she'd seemed so familiar with violence, why she'd handled her injuries with such stoic calm. This wasn't just a woman seeking revenge for an old wrong. This was someone who'd just committed a crime and was running for her life. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Before the storm passes? Maybe a week. Before they organize a search party?" She shrugged. "Depends on whether Thomas is dead or just wounded. If he's talking, they'll know where to look." Outside, the snow was falling harder now, already beginning to accumulate on the ground. Soon the passes would be blocked, the trails impassable. They would be trapped here together. A broken woman seeking justice for old wrongs, and the man who'd spent 30 years running from them. Boone padded over to Lila May and gently laid his head on her lap, offering the kind of simple comfort that only animals seem to understand. She stroked his fur with shaking hands, and Silas saw something in her face that looked almost like peace. "I used to have a dog," she said quietly. "When I was very small before the fire, a little terrier named Pip. He used to sleep at the foot of my bed and bark at strangers. What happened to him? He died in the fire too. Everything died in the fire." The words hung between them, like a bridge across 30 years of guilt and grief. Outside, the storm was building to a fury that would soon make the mountain impassable. They were alone now, truly alone, with nothing but the truth and the long winter ahead of them. Silas looked at this woman who'd traveled across a continent to find him, who'd fled her own wedding and possibly committed murder to reach this moment of confrontation. She was dangerous, damaged, and possibly the only person alive who understood the weight he'd been carrying all these years. "Well then," he said, moving to help her back to the bed. "I suppose we'd better figure out how we're going to survive each other." The storm raged for 3 days, turning the world outside the cabin into a howling white void. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that reached nearly to the roof, and the wind screamed through the pines with a voice that seemed to carry all the loneliness of the mountain peaks. Inside, two people who should have been enemies learned the strange intimacy that comes from shared survival. Layla May's recovery was slow but steady. The bruises on her ribs faded from deep purple to yellow-green, and the cuts on her hands and face healed cleanly under Silas's careful ministrations. He'd fashioned a makeshift wheelchair from a kitchen chair and some old wagon wheels he'd found in his storage shed, giving her back some measure of independence within the cabin's confines. But it was the small things that unsettled him most. The way she knew exactly where he kept his medical supplies without being told. How she anticipated his routines before he'd established them in her presence. The casual familiarity with which she moved through his sanctuary. "You've been watching me," he said on the third morning, as she handed him his coffee cup before he'd even finished brewing it. "Not watching, learning." She settled into her improvised chair with the fluid grace of someone who'd adapted to limitations long ago. "My lawyer hired investigators. For years. They sent me reports about your daily habits, your trap lines, even what books you read by firelight." Silas felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. "Why?" "Because I needed to know who you'd become. Whether you deserved forgiveness or revenge." Her fingers worried at something in her lap, a piece of torn fabric she'd been carrying since he found her. "I needed to understand if you were the same man who killed my family, or if you'd become someone different." He watched her hands work the fabric, recognizing it as part of her wedding dress. The silk was stained and torn, but she held it like a talisman, something that connected her to a moment of decision that had changed everything. "And what did you decide?" "That you were both." She looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. The man who made that terrible mistake, and the man who spent 30 years trying to atone for it. Outside, a tree branch snapped under the weight of snow, crashing against the cabin wall with a sound like gunfire. Boone lifted his head from where he'd been dozing by the fire, alert for danger that never came. The dog had taken to sleeping between Silas's bed and Lila May's makeshift sleeping area, as if he'd appointed himself guardian of them both. "Tell me about the wedding," Silas said quietly. Tell me about what happened. Lila May's hands stilled on the torn fabric. For a long moment, the only sounds were the storm outside and the crackling of the fire. When she spoke, her voice was steady but hollow, like someone recounting a story that had happened to someone else. Thomas Brennan, 35 years old, heir to a shipping fortune, considered quite a catch by Boston society standards. Her mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. He courted me for 6 months. Very proper, very respectful. He said my condition didn't matter to him, that he loved me for my mind and my spirit. But that wasn't true. Oh, it was true in a way. He did love my mind, specifically the fact that I'd inherited my family's estate and had no living relatives to protect me. She smoothed the fabric in her lap with careful fingers. The paralysis was a bonus. He thought it meant I'd be grateful for any attention. Too dependent to ever leave him. Silas felt that familiar rage building in his chest, the same protective fury that had consumed him when he'd first seen her injuries. What changed his mind? Our wedding night. The words came out flat, emotionless. I'd had my lawyer draw up papers before the ceremony, legal documents that would have given me control over my own inheritance, even after marriage. Thomas found them in my trunk while I was changing out of my dress. She reached into the folds of her makeshift chair and withdrew something that made Silas's breath catch. It was half of a wedding photograph, torn raggedly down the middle. The half that remained showed Lila May in her white dress, beautiful and radiant, but alone. The groom's half had been ripped away, leaving only empty space beside her. He said I'd betrayed him, that I'd made him look like a fool, that a cripple had no right to dictate terms to her husband. Her voice remained steady, but Silas could see the tremor in her hands. He hit me first. When I fell out of my chair, he said it was time I learned my place. So you shot him. I reached for the gun I'd hidden in my bouquet. I always carry a weapon. Learned that lesson early, after a few encounters with men who thought my condition made me helpless. She looked directly at him now, unflinching. I put 2 bullets in his chest at close range. Then I gathered what I could carry and left. The photograph fluttered in her grip, and Silas could see where her fingernails had dug crescents into the paper. This wasn't just evidence of her crime. It was a symbol of everything she'd lost, everything she'd had to destroy to survive. Do you regret it? He asked, killing him. No, her answer was immediate, certain. Marrying him in the first place? Every day. I let loneliness make me stupid. I wanted so badly to believe that someone could love me despite... She gestured at her useless legs. I should have known better. Boone rose from his position by the fire and padded over to her, resting his massive head on her lap with gentle understanding. She buried her fingers in his thick fur, and Silas saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. He's a good judge of character, Silas said, nodding toward the dog. Took him 3 years to trust me completely. Animals see what we really are, not what we pretend to be. She scratched behind Boone's ears, earning a contented sigh from the husky. He knows I'm not a threat to you, aren't you? The question hung between them like smoke from the fire. Lila May considered it seriously, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames. I came here to confront the man who destroyed my life, she said finally. I thought I knew what that would look like, what I would say, what I would do. But this... She gestured around the cabin at him, at the strange domestic peace they'd fallen into despite everything. This wasn't part of the plan. What was the plan? Make you face what you'd done. Make you understand the cost of your mistake. Make you suffer the way I've suffered. Her voice carried no venom, just tired honesty. Maybe kill you if it came to that. And now? Now I don't know. She looked down at the torn photograph in her hands. Revenge is supposed to feel clean, simple. You hurt me, so I hurt you back. But nothing about this feels simple. The wind gusted against the windows, reminding them both of the storm that held them captive. Snow continued to fall, piling higher against the walls, sealing them into this strange sanctuary where past and present collided in ways neither had expected. There's something else, Lila May said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Something I haven't told you. Silas waited, recognizing the weight of unspoken secrets. The investigators I hired, they didn't just watch you. They watched for other people who might be looking for you too. She met his eyes with an expression he couldn't read. You're not the only one with blood on your hands from that night 30 years ago. And some debts take longer to collect than others. Before he could ask what she meant, Boone's ears pricked forward, and he let out a low growl. Outside, barely audible over the storm, came the sound of horses struggling through deep snow. Someone was coming up the mountain. Expecting company? Leela May asked, her hand already moving toward the gun she kept within reach. Silas shook his head, moving to the window to peer through the swirling snow. No one comes up here in weather like this. No one who wants to be welcomed anyway. The sound grew closer, multiple horses, men shouting orders to each other over the wind. Whoever was out there, they were determined and well-equipped. The kind of people who didn't let a little thing like a blizzard stop them from their business. How many people knew you were coming here? Silas asked, checking his rifle and moving away from the windows. Only my lawyer. And he's been dead for 2 weeks. The words hit Silas like a physical blow. Dead lawyer, missing bride. Been riding through a blizzard to reach his cabin. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. They're not here for me, he realized. They're here for you. The riders circled the cabin like wolves testing their prey, their horses snorting and stamping in the deep snow. Through the frost-covered windows, Silas could make out at least 4 men, maybe more, all bundled against the storm, but moving with the purposeful coordination of professionals. These weren't random drifters or lost travelers, they were hunters, and they'd found their quarry. Leela May maneuvered her makeshift wheelchair away from the windows with practiced efficiency, positioning herself where she could see the door while remaining behind cover. Her hand rested on the small pistol she kept at her side, and Silas noticed her breathing had become controlled, measured. This wasn't panic, this was preparation. Who are they? He whispered, moving to his rifle rack and selecting his best long-range weapon. Brennan men, most likely. Thomas's family has money, influence, and a long memory for insults. She checked her pistol cylinder with the casual competence of someone who'd handled firearms her entire life. They probably think I'm hiding up here like some wounded animal. Aren't you? Her laugh was sharp, humorless. I'm not hiding. I'm healing. There's a difference. One of the riders broke away from the group and approached the cabin's front door. Even through the swirling snow, Silas could see the man was large, confident, wearing a badge that caught what little light filtered through the storm clouds. A federal marshal, then. The Brennans had reached deep into their political connections to track her down. Silas Crowley! The marshal's voice boomed across the clearing. We know you're in there. We have business to discuss. Silas felt his blood chill. They knew his name, his real name. After 30 years of careful anonymity, his past had finally caught up with him in the worst possible way. How do they know who you are? Leela May demanded, her dark eyes sharp with sudden suspicion. I don't know. But even as he said it, pieces were falling into place. The investigators she'd hired, the reports about his daily life, the careful tracking of his movements. Unless your people weren't as careful as you thought. Crowley, the marshal called again. We're not here for you. We want the woman. Turn her over, and we'll leave you in peace. Leela May's grip tightened on her weapon. Like hell they will. The Brennans don't leave witnesses, and you've seen too much. Through the window, Silas watched the other riders spreading out to surround the cabin completely. These men had done this before. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd cornered fugitives in isolated places and understood the value of cutting off escape routes. There's something you need to see, Leela May said suddenly, reaching into her dress and withdrawing a folded piece of paper. I should have shown you this earlier, but She hesitated, then handed him the document. I needed to know if I could trust you first. Silas unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a sheriff's badge, his old badge, wrapped in official correspondence from the territorial government. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, and the signature at the bottom made his heart skip. Sheriff Crowley, your resignation was never officially accepted. in light of recent developments regarding the Hartwell case and new evidence that has come to light. The territorial government hereby reinstates you to active duty with full authority to investigate and resolve matters related to said case. Your oath of office remains binding. New evidence? He whispered. The real outlaws you were looking for that night? They were caught 2 months ago in Colorado. Dying man's confession included details about the Hartwell raid, details that proved your family was innocent of harboring criminals. Lila May's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. You were right to go after them. Your timing was just 30 years too early. The words hit him like a physical blow. 30 years of guilt, 30 years of exile, 30 years of believing he'd destroyed innocent lives, and it had all been based on incomplete information. The Hartwells had been harboring outlaws, just not the ones he'd been chasing that night. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I needed to see who you'd become first. The man who shot first and asked questions later, or the man who spent 3 decades trying to make amends. She gestured toward the hidden badge in his hands. That badge came with a letter from my lawyer before he died. He said if you were the man he believed you to be, you'd earn the right to wear it again. Outside, the marshal was losing patience. Crowley, you've got 30 seconds to open this door, or we're coming in hard. Silas looked at the badge in his hands, the tarnished star that had once meant everything to him. That had become a symbol of his greatest failure, that now represented a chance at something he'd never dared hope for, redemption. The Brennans killed your lawyer, didn't they? He asked. Probably. He sent me a telegram saying he'd discovered something important about Thomas's family, something that would change everything. He was found dead in his office 2 days later. Apparent robbery gone wrong. Her voice carried the bitter knowledge of someone who'd seen too much violence, disguised as coincidence. That's when I knew I had to run. The sound of boots on the cabin's porch told them their time was up. Silas stood, weighing the badge in his hand, feeling the weight of 30 years of guilt and the possibility of 30 more years of purpose. You know what this means, he said, pinning the star to his shirt with steady fingers. If I'm still a lawman, I can't let them take you without due process. And if I'm still a fugitive, I can't surrender without a fight. Boone rose from his position by the fire, hackles raised, sensing the violence that was about to erupt around them. The dog positioned himself between his humans and the door, a loyal guardian ready to defend his pack against any threat. Sheriff Crowley, Lila May said formally, her voice carrying a note of respect he hadn't heard before. I formally request your protection as an officer of the law. Granted. He moved to the window, rifle ready, and called out to the men surrounding his cabin. This is Sheriff Silas Crowley. The woman you're seeking is under my protection. If you want her, you'll have to go through proper legal channels. The marshal's laughter was harsh, mocking. Your authority died with your reputation 30 years ago, old man. Stand aside, or we'll move you aside. My authority was just reinstated by territorial command, Silas replied, his voice carrying the steel that had once made him respected from Bitter Creek to Helena. And this woman is now under the protection of the law. You want her, you'll need a proper warrant and jurisdiction. We've got all the jurisdiction we need, came the reply, followed by the unmistakable sound of multiple weapons being cocked. Last chance, Crowley. Silas looked at Lila May, sitting straight in her improvised wheelchair, gun ready, eyes bright with determination despite the impossible odds they faced. She'd traveled across a continent to find him, and now they were about to die together, defending a principle that had taken 30 years to understand. Any regrets? He asked. Just one. Her smile was sad but genuine. I wish we'd had more time to figure out what this was becoming. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and snow, and the mountain peace that Silas had guarded for 30 years finally came to an end. The first gunshot shattered the morning silence like breaking glass. Silas dove sideways as the window beside him exploded inward, showering the cabin floor with ice-sharp fragments. The marshal's men weren't interested in negotiation. They'd come to collect their prize, and anyone standing in their way was expendable. Lila May rolled her wheelchair behind the heavy oak table Silas had built years ago, using it as a shield while she returned fire with precise, measured shots. Her small pistol cracked like a whip, and through the chaos, Silas heard one of the attackers cry out in pain. "Kitchen window!" she called out, reloading with practiced efficiency. Two men coming around the back. Silas had already spotted them through the corner of his eye. These weren't federal marshals. They moved wrong, shot too wild, lacked the discipline of real lawmen. I had guns then, and the Brennan family had paid to clean up their embarrassing problem without getting their own hands dirty. Boone crouched low beside the fireplace, ears flat against his head but eyes alert. The dog understood violence, had seen it before in his early life as a stray. He waited for a signal from his master, ready to help defend their territory against these invaders. "How many did you count?" Silas asked, working the bolt on his rifle and chambering another round. 6, maybe 7. Lila May's voice was steady, despite the lead flying around them. "The marshal's the only real lawman. The rest are Brennan money." Silas peered through a gap in the logs and squeezed off a shot that sent one of the flanking men scrambling for better cover. The gold locket around Lila May's neck caught the firelight as she moved, and he found himself staring at it with sudden recognition. "That locket," he said during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Where did you get it?" "It was my mother's, the only thing that survived the fire." She touched it unconsciously, a gesture of protection and remembrance. "Why?" "Because I remember it." "From that night. Your mother was wearing it when—" He stopped, the memory too painful to voice completely. "When you carried her body out of the house." Lila May finished the sentence with quiet understanding. "I know. The investigator's report was very thorough. The locket held a photograph of a young girl with dark hair and serious eyes, a child who would grow up to become the woman now fighting beside him. Inside the gold casing, Silas could make out an inscription worn smooth by years of handling. Sarah Elizabeth Hartwell, beloved daughter. She was trying to save this for you," he said, understanding flooding through him. "When the house was burning, she wasn't trying to escape. She was going back for your things." "I know." The words came out barely above a whisper. The investigator found witnesses. Neighbors who saw her run back inside. "She died trying to preserve something of your childhood for you." The weight of that revelation settled over Silas like a physical burden. Not only had his mistake killed Lila May's family, but her mother had died specifically trying to save mementos of the daughter she'd already lost to safety. The guilt he'd carried for 30 years suddenly felt inadequate, a pale shadow of the true cost of his actions. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head, bringing him back to the immediate danger. Through the broken window, he could see the marshal directing his men with professional competence. The man had positioned his shooters to cover all escape routes while keeping his main force in reserve. This wasn't a random assault. It was a coordinated operation designed to take prisoners alive if possible, eliminate them if necessary. "They're not trying to kill us," Silas realized. "They want you alive. Dead women can't confess to crimes they didn't commit." Lila May's voice carried bitter knowledge. "The Brennans need me to stand trial for Thomas's murder. A family tragedy plays better in the newspapers than a mysterious disappearance. What did your lawyer discover about them?" "Thomas wasn't the first husband to die under suspicious circumstances. There were 2 others, wealthy men who married into the Brennan family and then suffered fatal accidents after signing over their assets." She paused to reload again, her movements economical and sure. "The family's been running a sophisticated marriage fraud for decades. Thomas just picked the wrong target this time." The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. The Brennans weren't just seeking justice for their dead son. They were protecting a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Lila May wasn't just a murderer in their eyes. She was a threat to their entire way of life. "We need to get word to the territorial authorities," Silas said. "If what you're saying is true, my lawyer tried that. He's dead." The federal judge he contacted died of food poisoning 3 days later. The Brennan family has friends in very high places. A new sound reached them through the gunfire, the distinctive crack of a rifle much larger than anything the attackers had been using. One of the men outside screamed, and suddenly the shooting from the south side of the cabin stopped entirely. "That's not one of theirs," Lila May said, confusion clear in her voice. Silas moved to the back window and peered carefully through the gap. What he saw made his heart leap with desperate hope. A lone figure on horseback sat on the ridge overlooking the cabin, working the bolt of a long-range rifle with mechanical precision. The rider was too far away to identify, but the marksmanship was extraordinary, picking off the attackers with shots that would challenge an expert even in good weather. "Friend of yours?" Lila May asked. "I don't have any friends." But even as he said it, Silas felt a flicker of recognition. The way the rider sat his horse, the deliberate patience between shots, it reminded him of someone from his past. Someone he hadn't seen in 30 years. The marshal's voice carried across the clearing, filled with frustrated rage. "Fall back! Fall back to the trees!" The attackers began withdrawing under cover of the storm, dragging their wounded with them. But this wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical repositioning. They'd learned the cabin was better defended than expected, and they were adapting their strategy accordingly. "They'll wait for the storm to pass," Lila May said, understanding the situation as clearly as he did. "Then they'll bring up more men, maybe artillery. The Brennans have the resources to turn this into a siege, not if we don't give them the chance." Silas moved to his storage chest and began pulling out items he hadn't used in years. Rope, climbing gear, the kind of equipment a man needed to move through mountain terrain in winter. "There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles north of here. Played out years ago, but the tunnels are still sound. If we can reach it, I can't travel 2 miles through snow in a wheelchair. Then we make you something that can." He looked at the broken wheelchair parts scattered around the cabin, then at the snowshoes hanging on his wall. "Mountain folk have been adapting to winter for generations. We'll find a way." Through the window, the mysterious rider was still picking off targets with methodical precision. Whoever it was, they'd bought them time. Maybe enough time to attempt an escape that would have been suicide an hour ago. "Why are you doing this?" Lila May asked suddenly. "You could turn me over to them. Tell them I forced you to help me. They might even believe it." Silas looked at her, this woman who'd traveled across a continent seeking justice, who'd killed to defend herself, who'd somehow brought both his past and his redemption to his mountain sanctuary. The locket around her neck caught the firelight again, reminding him of all the lives that had been lost, all the choices that had led to this moment. "Because 30 years ago, I failed to protect your family. I won't fail to protect you." The words hung between them like a vow. And for the first time since he'd found her in the snow, Silas saw something that might have been forgiveness in her dark eyes. The leather portfolio fell open across the cabin table like a map of sins, its contents spilling out in damning detail. Lila May had kept it hidden beneath her torn wedding dress, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the mountain weather. Now, as gunfire echoed sporadically from the ridge where the mysterious sniper continued to hold the Brennan men at bay, she spread the documents before Silas with shaking hands. "These are the papers my lawyer died for," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. Everything he discovered about the Brennan family business. Silas picked up the first document, a marriage certificate dated 1889, bearing the name Margaret Cleary. Across it, someone had written in red ink, "Deceased, hunting accident, 1890. The woman's death had left her entire inheritance to her grieving husband, Thomas Brennan Sr., Thomas's father, Lila May explained. "The first one we could prove anyway. Margaret lasted exactly 11 months after the wedding. Long enough for the inheritance laws to take effect, not long enough to enjoy her money." The next document showed a similar pattern. Eleanor Whitman, deceased, carriage accident, 1892. Then Catherine Moore, deceased, drowning, 1895. Each woman wealthy, each death conveniently timed, each inheritance flowing directly to the Brennan family coffers. "How many?" Silas asked. though he was already counting the certificates spread before him. 9 that we could document. Probably more that they were better at hiding. Lila May's fingers traced the edge of a photograph, showing a young woman in wedding white, smiling beside a man whose face had been deliberately obscured. My lawyer spent 3 years tracking down relatives, investigating deaths that were ruled accidental. He found patterns that should have been obvious to anyone looking, but no one was looking. The Brennans made sure of that. Judges bought, coroners influenced, newspaper editors convinced to treat these as society tragedies rather than criminal investigations. She pulled out a letter bearing the seal of the territorial government. They had protection all the way to the capital. Silas studied the official correspondence, recognizing signatures from men he'd once respected. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined, a network of complicity that stretched from local officials to federal appointees. The Brennan money had purchased not just silence, but active participation in their crimes. The letter about my reinstatement, he said slowly. How do you know it's legitimate? Because my lawyer was careful. He knew he was walking into dangerous territory, so he built safeguards. Multiple copies of every document, trusted contacts in clean jurisdictions, fail-safe protocols, if anything happened to him. She pointed to a coded notation at the bottom of his commission letter. That mark means the order came from Washington, not from Brennan-controlled offices. A rifle shot cracked from the ridge, followed by an angry shout from the attackers. Their mysterious benefactor was still keeping the enemy pinned down, but Silas could see movement in the trees. The Brennan men were working to flank the sniper's position, and once they succeeded, the siege would resume in earnest. We need to move, he said, already gathering supplies for their escape attempt. Storm's breaking, and daylight will give them too many advantages. There's something else you need to see first. Lila. May withdrew a final document from the portfolio, a sealed envelope bearing his name in elegant handwriting. My lawyer left this specifically for you. Instructions were to give it to you only if you chose to help me. Silas recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Judge Harrison Blackwood, the territorial magistrate who'd sworn him in as sheriff 30 years ago. Blackwood had been a fair man, incorruptible in an era when corruption was commonplace. If he was involved in this, the situation was more complex than Silas had understood. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper and a small brass key. Sheriff Crowley, if you are reading this, then Sarah has found you, and you have chosen to stand with justice rather than convenience. The key opens a safety deposit box at the Territorial Bank in Helena. Inside, you will find complete evidence of the Brennan conspiracy, including documentation of their attempts to silence me. I fear I may not live to see this matter resolved, but I trust you to finish what we started 30 years ago. Your original investigation was correct. The Hartwells were involved with criminals. Your methods were flawed, but your instincts were sound. This is your chance to close the case properly. H. Blackwood. Blackwood's been tracking this for 30 years, Silas breathed. Ever since the night my life fell apart. He knew the Hartwells were connected to something bigger. Your raid disrupted their operation before he could gather enough evidence to bring down the entire network. Lila May's voice carried a note of something that might have been pride. He's been waiting 3 decades for the chance to finish the job. The sound of horses moving through snow reached them from multiple directions. The Brennan men were repositioning again, preparing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm their defenses. Time was running out. The mine shaft, Silas said, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle. If we can reach it before they close the circle, I'll slow you down. Lila May gestured to the improvised wheelchair that had become both her mobility and her prison. These wheels weren't built for mountain terrain. Then we'll build something that was. Silas moved to the corner where he kept his winter equipment. Snowshoes, climbing rope, the kind of gear that had kept him alive in the mountains for 12 years. Ever been on a travois? A what? Indian transportation. 2 poles, some rope, designed to be pulled across any terrain. His hands were already working, lashing together a frame that could support her weight while distributing it across the snow. The Lakota used them to move their wounded across the plains. We'll adapt it for mountain travel. As he worked, Lila May gathered the documents back into their protective portfolio. Each paper represented months of investigation, lives lost in the pursuit of truth, and a conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for decades. The evidence would be worthless if they didn't survive to present it. Why didn't Blackwood act sooner? She asked. If he knew, because knowing and proving are different things, and because the Brennans were careful to operate within the law, technically speaking. Murder disguised as accident, inheritance fraud disguised as tragedy. Silas tested the travois frame, satisfied with its strength. He needed someone with jurisdiction and motivation to pursue the case properly, someone like a sheriff who'd been carrying guilt for 30 years. Someone like that. Yes. Through the window, he could see the mysterious sniper falling back from the ridge, overwhelmed by superior numbers. The Brennan men were advancing again, moving with the confidence of hunters who'd finally cornered their prey. Time to go, Silas said, helping Lila May transfer from her wheelchair to the makeshift travois. The mine shaft's 2 miles through rough terrain, but the snow will cover our tracks, and if we don't make it. Silas looked at this woman who'd brought both his past and his future to his mountain sanctuary, who'd trusted him with her life despite having every reason to hate him. The documents she carried could bring down a criminal empire that had operated for decades. Her testimony could provide justice for victims whose deaths had been dismissed as accidents. Then we'll die, knowing we tried to do the right thing, he said, securing the portfolio to his pack and shouldering the travois harness. Sometimes that's all the redemption a man gets. Boone padded to the door, sensing the urgency of their departure. The dog's thick coat was built for this kind of travel, and his loyalty would see them through whatever dangers lay ahead. As they slipped out the cabin's back door into the swirling snow, Silas caught a glimpse of their mysterious ally disappearing into the trees. Whoever it was, they'd given them a chance, maybe the only one they'd get. Behind them, the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 12 years stood empty, its windows broken, its peace forever shattered. Ahead lay 2 miles of treacherous mountain terrain, and the slim hope of reaching safety before the Brennan men caught up with them. The hunt was on, the bounty hunters. Warrant was signed in blood. Silas discovered it when they stopped, to rest in a grove of pines halfway to the mine shaft. The document clutched in the frozen fingers of a dead man who'd been tracking them through the storm. The corpse lay half buried in snow, a bullet hole in his forehead marking the work of their mysterious sniper ally. But it was the papers in his coat that made Silas's blood run cold. Wanted for the murder of Thomas Brennan, he read aloud, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Dead or alive? $5,000 reward. Lila May pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, studying the official document with weary eyes. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. No wonder they're willing to chase us through a blizzard. But Silas was looking at the signature at the bottom of the warrant, and his hands began to shake. The name written there in flowing script belonged to someone he'd trusted, someone he'd served under, someone who should have been dead. This is impossible, he whispered. What? The signature. It's from Marshal William Pike. He looked up at her with haunted eyes. Pike died 5 years ago. I attended his funeral. Lila May took the warrant from his trembling fingers, examining it closely. The paper's fresh. This was issued 3 days ago. She looked up at him with growing understanding. Either this is an elaborate forgery, or your friend Pike isn't as dead as you thought. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them like angry spirits. Boone whined and pressed closer to the travois, his instincts warning of dangers, both human and natural. Through the trees, they could hear their pursuers calling to each other, organizing search patterns that would soon bring them to this exact spot. Pike was the only man who knew the real details of the Hartwell case, Silas said, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. The only one I trusted with the complete truth about what happened that night. What if he was working with the Brennans even then? What if the whole thing was orchestrated to protect their operation? The possibility hit Silas like a physical blow. Pike had been his mentor, the man who'd recommended him for the sheriff position, who'd guided his early career. If Pike had been corrupt from the beginning, then everything Silas believed about that night was built on lies. The outlaws, he said slowly. Pike told me where to find them. He gave me the information that led to the Hartwell raid. Information that turned out to be wrong. Not wrong. Misdirected. Understanding flooded through him with sickening clarity. The Hartwells were harboring criminals, just not the ones I was told to look for. Pike sent me after the wrong gang to protect the real operation. A rifle shot cracked in the distance, followed by shouting. Their pursuers were getting closer, and the grove of pines that had seemed like sanctuary was quickly becoming a trap. "We need to move," Lila May said. But Silas was already examining the dead bounty hunter's equipment. The man had been well supplied, carrying gear that spoke of serious money behind his mission. But it was the second document in his coat that revealed the true scope of their predicament. Authorization for federal manhunt, Silas read. Multiple suspects wanted in connection with terrorism, murder, and conspiracy against the territorial government. Terrorism. Lila May's voice was sharp with disbelief. "They're painting us as enemies of the state. Pike's signature gives them authority to use any means necessary to bring us in." He folded the warrant and tucked it into his own coat. Dead or alive suddenly became the preferred option. The sound of horses crashing through undergrowth told them their time was up. Silas shouldered the travois harness again, but as they prepared to move, a figure stepped out from behind a massive pine tree ahead of them. The man was tall, weathered, wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as comfortable in the wilderness. His rifle was trained casually in their direction, but his posture suggested conversation rather than immediate violence. When he pushed back his hat, Silas felt his world tilt on its axis. "Hello, Silas," Marshal William Pike said with a smile that held no warmth. "Been a long time." Lila May's hand moved toward her pistol, but Pike's rifle shifted slightly in warning. "I wouldn't, miss. I'm here to talk, not to shoot, though I'm prepared for either." "You're supposed to be dead," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dead to the world that knew Marshal Pike, but Thomas Brennan Sr. paid very well for certain services, and I found the work agreeable." Pike's smile widened. "Amazing how a man can disappear when he has the right connections and sufficient motivation. You bastard! You've been working with them all along." "Not all along. I started honest, same as you. But the Brennans made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Help them maintain their business interests, or watch my own family suffer unfortunate accidents." Pike's expression hardened. "I chose family over principle. You chose principle over common sense. The pieces of 30 years of deception fell into place with devastating clarity." Pike had fed Silas false information about the outlaw gang, knowing it would lead to the wrong target. When the Hartwell raid went bad, Pike had helped orchestrate the cover-up, ensuring that the real criminals remained protected while Silas took the blame. "The letters that came to my cabin," Silas said. "You knew about them. I've been watching you for decades. Making sure you stayed buried, stayed silent, stayed guilty. The Brennans wanted you alive but neutralized, a broken man who'd never again pose a threat to their operations." Pike gestured toward Lila May. "Then she had to go and stir up old business. My lawyer found the connection," Lila May said, her voice steady despite the gun trained on them. "He tracked the real outlaws to Colorado, got their confession. That's when you had him killed. Regrettable but necessary. The old fool couldn't leave well enough alone." Pike's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "Same problem I'm having with you two. Some people just won't stay buried." Through the trees, the sound of their other pursuers was getting closer. Pike cocked his head, listening to the approaching riders with professional interest. "Those men work for me now. Bounty hunters mostly, but they follow orders and ask few questions. They think they're chasing dangerous fugitives who killed a federal marshal, he chuckled. Which technically you will have, just not the marshal they think. What do you want, Pike? Same thing I've wanted for 30 years, for this to end quietly. You surrender, take responsibility for the lawyer's death and the Brennan boys' murder, and I'll make sure it's quick. Clean death, heroic last stand, maybe even a mention in the territorial newspapers about the mad sheriff who finally met justice. Lila May shifted position on the travois, and Silas caught the subtle movement of her hand toward the portfolio containing the evidence. She was preparing for something, waiting for the right moment, and if we refuse, then my boys run you down like the dangerous criminals you are, and the story becomes about a tragic pursuit through the mountains. Either way, the Brennan business interests remain protected, and I continue to enjoy a very comfortable retirement. The wind gusted through the pines, sending snow cascading from the branches above. In the distance, wolves howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to carry all the weight of choices made and consequences faced. There's one thing you didn't count on, Silas said quietly. What's that? I'm not the same man who made that mistake 30 years ago. And she's not the broken victim you thought you were hunting? Pike's expression shifted slightly, caution replacing confidence. Meaning? Meaning we know about the safety deposit box in Helena. We know about Judge Blackwood's evidence. And we know you can't let us live long enough to reach the authorities, no matter what deal you offer. The marshal's rifle came up, but Lila May was already moving. The small pistol she'd hidden beneath her blanket cracked twice in rapid succession, and Pike staggered backward with a look of genuine surprise. Impossible, he gasped, looking down at the spreading red stain on his chest. You're a cripple. I'm a survivor, Lila May replied, already reloading. And I've had 30 years to practice. Pike fell backward into the snow, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. The sound would bring his men running, but for the moment the architect of 3 decades of deception lay dying in the mountain snow. Why? Silas asked, kneeling beside his former mentor. Why betray everything we stood for? Pike's eyes were already glazing, but he managed one last bitter smile. Because principles don't feed your family. Because the law serves whoever pays for it. Because the words died with him, leaving only the wind and the approaching sound of horses. Silas stood slowly, shouldering the travois harness with renewed determination. The mine shaft's still a mile away, he said. And now they'll be coming hard. Then we'd better move fast, Lila May replied, tucking her pistol away. Because I didn't come this far just to die in the snow. Behind them, Marshal William Pike lay still in the growing darkness, the architect of corruption finally called to account. Ahead lay the promise of sanctuary and the hope of justice. If they could reach it before the night, claimed them all, the hidden rifle cache lay buried beneath 3 feet of snow and 30 years of careful concealment. Silas had prepared for this day without knowing it would ever come. The day when his mountain sanctuary would become a battlefield and his past would demand a final reckoning. His weathered hands worked quickly in the frigid air, clearing snow from the false bottom of an old tree stump that had disguised his weapon stockpile since the day he'd first climbed these peaks. How many rifles? Lila May asked, her breath forming clouds as she watched the tree line for signs of pursuit. Pike's men would have heard the gunshots by now, would have found their leader's body, would be coming with blood in their eyes and vengeance on their minds. Enough. Silas lifted a Winchester repeating rifle from its oiled wrapping, checking the action with practiced efficiency. I always figured someday the past would catch up. Man doesn't live alone in the mountains without making contingency plans. The rifle cache contained more than weapons, boxes of ammunition, emergency medical supplies, even a small telegraph key with wire enough to reach the nearest relay station. Everything a former lawman might need to make a final stand or call for backup that might never come. Telegraph. Lila May examined the equipment with surprise. I thought you'd cut all ties to civilization. Cut ties, yes. Burned bridges, no. He tested the wire connections, satisfied that the system would still function despite years of mountain weather. Judge Blackwood insisted I maintain some way to communicate if the situation ever required it. Looks like his foresight was better than mine. Boone paced restlessly between them and the direction of their pursuers, his thick coat dusted with snow, but his eyes alert for danger. The dog understood that their peaceful mountain life was ending, that the pack he'd protected for 7 years was preparing for a fight that might scatter them forever. How long to reach the mine shaft? Leela May checked her pistol again, counting remaining ammunition with the careful attention of someone who'd learned never to waste a shot. 20 minutes if we move fast, an hour if we take defensive positions along the way. Silas shouldered one of the rifles and distributed ammunition between his various pockets. The question is whether we run or fight. What's at the mine shaft that makes it worth reaching? Explosives. Enough dynamite to bring down half the mountain if necessary. His expression was grim but determined. The mine played out years ago, but the blasting equipment was left behind. I've been maintaining it just in case. The implications hung between them like smoke from a campfire. If they reached the mine, they could make a stand that would be heard for miles. If they died there, at least they'd take their enemies with them, and ensure the truth about the Brennan conspiracy died with witnesses who could never be silenced. Through the trees, the sound of voices carried on the wind, men organizing a search pattern, calling out positions, moving with the methodical efficiency of professional hunters. Pike's death had eliminated their leader, but it had also removed any restraint on their methods. These men would shoot first and fabricate explanations later. 6 men, maybe 7, Leela May said, her hearing sharpened by years of compensating for her physical limitations. They're spreading out to flank us. Then we don't give them the chance. Silas began assembling a pack with their most essential supplies, the legal documents, medical equipment, enough ammunition for a sustained fight. The old mining road is washed out, but there's a deer trail that leads directly to the main shaft. Steep climb, but it offers cover most of the way. As he worked, memories flooded back, not of guilt and regret this time, but of the skills that had made him a good sheriff before fear and inexperience had corrupted his judgment. Reading terrain, anticipating enemy movements, understanding how to use natural cover to maximum advantage. The instincts were still there, buried beneath decades of self-doubt, but awakening now when they were needed most. "There's something I need to tell you," Leela May said suddenly, her voice carrying a weight that made him pause in his preparations. "About why I really came here. About what I was hoping to find. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time." She pulled the gold locket from around her neck, opening it to reveal not just the photograph of herself as a child, but a second image hidden behind it. "I didn't come here just for revenge or justice. I came here looking for answers about my family that only you could provide." The hidden photograph showed a young woman with familiar features, Leela May's mother, but not as Silas remembered her from that terrible night. This was an earlier image, showing her in the company of a man in a sheriff's uniform. The uniform was familiar because it was his own from his early days in Bitter Creek. "Your mother," he whispered, understanding flooding through him. "I knew her before the fire. She wrote about you in her diary. Said you were the only lawman who ever treated her family with respect, who believed they were trying to live honest lives despite their past connections." Leela May's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She trusted you, Sheriff Crowley. Even when everyone else assumed the worst about the Hartwell family, she believed you would protect them." The revelation hit him harder than any physical blow. He remembered now, Martha Hartwell, bringing him information about criminal activities in the county, serving as an unofficial informant while trying to distance her family from their outlaw associations. She'd been helping him build cases against the very criminals Pike had been protecting. "She was working with me," he said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "That's why the house was burned. Not to cover up a mistake, but to eliminate a witness. Pike knew she was feeding you information that could have exposed the whole network. The raid wasn't botched law enforcement. It was assassination disguised as duty." Leela May closed the locket with trembling fingers. My mother died because she chose to trust the law instead of corruption. The truth of it settled over Silas like a weight he'd been carrying without understanding its true burden. For 30 years, he'd believed his inexperience had killed innocent people. In reality, his integrity had made him a target. And Martha Hartwell had died because she'd chosen to stand with him against Pike's conspiracy. She wrote something else in her diary, Lila May continued. Said that if anything ever happened to her, she hoped you would watch over me. That you were the kind of man who would keep fighting for what's right, no matter the cost. Through the trees, their pursuers were getting closer. Silas could see movement now, dark shapes against the snow, moving with the coordination of men who'd hunted human prey before. Time was running out for preparation, for revelations, for anything except the violence that would determine whether truth or corruption prevailed. She was wrong about me, he said quietly, shouldering the pack and checking the travois one final time. I gave up fighting. I ran to the mountains and hid from my responsibilities. But you're fighting now. Lila May's voice was steady, certain. When it mattered most, when someone needed protection, you chose to stand and fight. That's the man she believed you could be. Boone suddenly stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The first of their pursuers had reached visual range, moving carefully through the undergrowth, but close enough now to spot them if they remained stationary much longer. Time to go, Silas said, lifting the travois harness. Stay low, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, don't hesitate to use that pistol. These men won't show mercy just because you're a woman. I learned that lesson on my wedding day, she replied grimly. They moved out of the grove like ghosts, Silas pulling the travois with smooth efficiency, while Lila May covered their rear with her weapon ready. The deer trail was treacherous in the snow, but it offered concealment that the main road couldn't provide. Behind them, shouts indicated their pursuers had found Pike's body and were now committed to running them down, regardless of orders or jurisdiction. The mine shaft was still half a mile away, up a slope that would test both their endurance and their luck. But for the first time since this ordeal began, Silas felt something approaching hope. They had weapons, they had evidence, and they had a destination that offered both sanctuary and the means to ensure their story would be heard. Most importantly, they had each other. Two people who'd found unexpected partnership in the face of overwhelming odds, who discovered that redemption sometimes came wearing the face of those you'd wronged, and that justice was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. Whatever happens at the mine, he said as they climbed through the snow, I want you to know something. Your mother was right to trust me. It just took me 30 years to remember why. Above them, the abandoned mine shaft waited in the mountain snow, its dark mouth promising either salvation or a tomb. Behind them, Pike's men followed like wolves on a blood trail, driven by money and vengeance in equal measure. The final confrontation was coming, and with it, the chance to settle accounts that had been 30 years in the making. The wheelchair had been transformed into something that belonged more on a battlefield than in a sick room. During their desperate climb to the mine shaft, Lila May had worked with methodical precision, using strips of her torn wedding dress to lash small explosive charges to the chair's frame, turning her symbol of limitation into an instrument of defiance. Hidden compartments that had once held personal items now bristled with ammunition and makeshift weapons crafted from mining equipment scattered along the abandoned trail. You sure about this? Silas asked, watching her make final adjustments to the improvised war machine. They'd reached the mine entrance just as the first of Pike's men appeared on the slope below, their dark shapes moving like predators against the white snow. I've been preparing for this moment my entire life, she replied, checking the small detonator she'd rigged to the chair's armrest. Every slight, every patronizing comment, every person who assumed I was helpless, it all led to this. The mine shaft opened into the mountain like a hungry mouth, its depths disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow sound and light equally. Ancient timber supports groaned under the weight of accumulated snow and decades of neglect. But the structure remained sound enough to provide cover for what was coming. Boone whined softly, pressing against Silas's leg as he sensed the violence that was about to erupt around them. The dog's loyalty had never wavered through 7 years of mountain solitude, and it wouldn't fail them now when they needed it most. How many charges? Silas positioned himself behind a natural rock formation that would provide cover while allowing clear shots down the slope. Enough to bring down the entrance if they try to storm us. Enough to take a few of them with us if it comes to that. Lila May's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she loaded her pistol one final time. The main cache is deeper in the tunnel, 20 pounds of dynamite that will collapse half the mountain. Through the swirling snow, their pursuers were advancing in a coordinated line, using available cover while maintaining sightlines that would prevent easy escape. These weren't random bounty hunters anymore. They moved with the discipline of military men, following tactics that spoke of professional training and serious money. Sheriff Crowley. The voice echoed across the slope, amplified by the mountain acoustics. "You're trapped. Surrender the woman, and we'll make this quick." "Counteroffer," Silas called back, his rifle trained on the lead figure. "Turn around and ride back to whoever's paying you, and maybe you'll live to spend the money." Harsh laughter carried on the wind. "Pike's dead because of you." "That makes this personal now." The first shot came without further warning, a rifle bullet that spanged off the rock beside Silas's head and sent stone fragments flying. The siege had begun in earnest, and there would be no more talking, no more negotiations, no more chances for peaceful resolution. Lila May's pistol cracked in response, and one of the attackers cried out in pain. Her marksmanship was extraordinary for someone firing from an unstable position, but Silas realized she was drawing on years of practice, born from necessity. When you couldn't run from trouble, you learned to face it with deadly precision. "Left flank," she called out, already reloading. 2 men trying to work around through the trees. Silas swung his rifle in that direction and squeezed off 2 quick shots that sent the flanking party diving for cover. The mine entrance provided excellent defensive positioning, but they were outnumbered and would eventually be overwhelmed by superior firepower. "The detonator," he said during a brief lull in the shooting. "How close do they need to be?" "Close enough to regret their life choices." Lila May's smile was fierce, predatory. "I didn't survive Thomas Brennan's wedding night just to die quietly in a hole in the ground." A new sound reached them over the gunfire. Horses approaching from a different direction, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. For a moment, Silas felt hope that reinforcements had arrived, that Judge Blackwood's allies had somehow tracked them to this remote battleground. Then he saw the riders emerge from the tree line, and his heart sank. More bounty hunters, or perhaps federal marshals, who'd finally responded to Pike's fabricated emergency. Either way, they were now completely surrounded. Trapped in the mine entrance, with no escape route except deeper into the mountain. "Company," he said grimly, watching the new arrivals take positions that completed the circle around their position. How many now? Too many. He counted at least 12 men in total, all armed, all positioned to prevent any possibility of breakout. "They're not taking any chances this time." Lila May looked down at her modified wheelchair, at the charges she'd so carefully prepared, at the detonator that would either be their salvation or their grave marker. "Then we make them pay for every yard." The shooting intensified as their enemies coordinated their assault, laying down covering fire while advancing teams moved closer to the mine entrance. Bullets whined off stone and timber, filling the air with deadly splinters and the acrid smell of gunpowder. But it was the sound from deeper in the mine that made them both freeze, a low rumbling that seemed to come from the mountain itself, as if something ancient and powerful had awakened in the darkness behind them. "What was that?" Lila May whispered. Before Silas could answer, a figure emerged from the mine's depths, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these tunnels intimately. The man was tall, weathered, wearing a badge that caught what little light filtered through the entrance. "Judge Blackwood," Silas breathed, hardly believing his eyes. "Sheriff Crowley," the judge replied calmly. as if meeting in a mine shaft during a gunfight was the most natural thing in the world. I believe it's time we finished what we started 30 years ago. The blood-stained wedding dress lay in tatters across the mine floor, finally abandoned as Lila May shed the last symbol of her captivity. Underneath, she wore practical clothes better suited for mountain warfare, dark wool and leather that would blend with the shadows while providing freedom of movement her elaborate gown never could. The transformation was complete, from society bride to mountain fighter, from victim to avenger. How long have you been waiting down there? Silas asked Judge Blackwood as bullets continued to ping off the mine entrance above their heads. 3 days. Ever since I received word that Pike was moving against you. Blackwood checked his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen more than his share of violence. I've been using the mine's back entrance, old ventilation shaft that comes out 2 miles down the mountain. Your visitors don't know about it. Visitors, Lila May said with bitter humor. Is that what we're calling hired killers now? Through the mine entrance, they could hear the bounty hunters coordinating their final assault. Voices called out positions, strategies, the kind of tactical communication that meant the siege was about to become a slaughter. Time was running out for anything except the violence that would determine who lived to tell the true story. The evidence, Blackwood said, nodding toward the portfolio still strapped to Silas's pack. Did you review it all? Enough to understand the scope. Silas adjusted his position behind the rock barrier, trying to get a clear shot at the advancing figures. 9 murders over 30 years, federal corruption, a conspiracy that reaches from here to Washington. 12 murders, Blackwood corrected grimly. We found 3 more after the portfolio was sealed, including my own deputy, who got too close to the truth. Lila May's hands worked methodically, redistributing the explosive charges from her wheelchair to strategic points around the mine entrance. If they were going to die here, they'd take as many enemies with them as possible and ensure the mine became their attacker's tomb as well. The telegraph, she said suddenly. You mentioned you could reach the relay station. What if we sent word now, before? Already done. Blackwood pulled a small device from his coat, a portable telegraph key connected to wire that disappeared into the mine's depths. Sent a full report to territorial headquarters 3 hours ago. Everything we know, everything we can prove, every name connected to the conspiracy. The sound of boots on stone told them their enemies were finally making their move. Dark shapes appeared at the mine entrance, advancing with weapons ready and determination born of desperation. These men knew they were fighting for more than money now. They were fighting to keep their own necks out of federal nooses. Now, Lila May whispered. Her hand on the first detonator, the explosion shook the entire mountain, bringing down a section of the mine entrance in a cascade of stone and timber that buried the first wave of attackers under tons of debris. Screams echoed across the slope, followed by angry shouts as the survivors regrouped and prepared for another assault. That'll slow them down, Silas said, but he could already see movement in the rubble. Some of the attackers had survived, and they were digging their way through with the fury of men who knew retreat was no longer an option. Not for long. Blackwood moved to a different position, his rifle trained on the gaps in the debris field. They'll come harder now. This is their last chance to silence us. Boone barked once, sharp and urgent, his attention focused not on the mine entrance, but on the tunnels behind them. Something was moving in the darkness, multiple somethings, approaching with stealth that spoke of military training. Back entrance, Silas realized. They found it. Impossible. That shaft's been hidden for... Blackwood's words were cut off as muzzle flashes erupted from the mine's depths. The bounty hunters had indeed found the back way in, turning their defensive position into a trap caught between attackers from 2 directions. The 3 defenders found themselves pressed into an ever-shrinking circle of safety. Lila May's remaining explosives could collapse the mine entirely, but that would bury them, along with their enemies. The main cache, she said, her voice steady despite the bullets flying around them. 20 pounds of dynamite deeper in the tunnel. If I can reach it, no. Silas's voice was firm, final. I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes. They weren't your mistakes, she replied, already moving toward the mine's depths. They were Pikes, they were the Brennans, they were the corruption that killed my family and ruined your life. But this is our choice. She abandoned her wheelchair completely now, pulling herself forward on her arms with the determination of someone who'd spent a lifetime adapting to limitations. The torn wedding dress trailed behind her like a ghost of the woman she'd been before violence had set her free. Lila May, tell them the truth, Sheriff Crowley. Tell them who Martha Hartwell really was and why she died. Make sure her daughter's story gets told. The gunfire intensified as their enemies pressed their advantage, sensing victory within reach. But Lila May was already disappearing into the mine's depths, carrying her mother's locket and 30 years of accumulated rage toward the darkness where the final judgment waited. Above them, the mountain began to rumble with the promise of an explosion that would be heard for miles. And with it, the end of secrets that had festered in darkness for far too long. The simple silver band caught the morning light as Silas turned it slowly in his weathered fingers. Examining the inscription he'd carved himself during the long winter months of recovery. LMC, Truth Sets Us Free. The ring was fashioned from silver ore he'd found in the collapsed mine tunnels. Metal that had been born in the same mountain that had witnessed both their destruction and their redemption. 6 months had passed since the explosion that brought down half of Mount Serenity and buried the last of the Brennan conspiracy beneath tons of Montana stone. The federal investigation that followed had vindicated everything Judge Blackwood had suspected and more, 12 confirmed murders. A corruption network that reached into Congress itself, and evidence that led to 17 arrests across 3 territories. Lila May sat in her new wheelchair on the cabin's front porch, watching Silas work in the garden they'd planted together come spring. Her legs would never heal, but everything else about her had been transformed by survival and truth. The fierce determination that had carried her through that terrible night in the mine had softened into something approaching peace. Though her eyes still held depths that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "You're going to wear a hole in that ring," she said, not looking up from the letter she was writing to the territorial newspapers. Even in isolation, she'd maintained her correspondence with the outside world, ensuring the story of what had happened continued to be told accurately, just making sure it's perfect. Silas set down his tools and moved to join her on the porch, Boone trailing behind with the lazy contentment of a dog whose pack was finally complete and safe. The cabin had been rebuilt, larger this time, with modifications that accommodated 2 people who'd learned to depend on each other in ways neither had expected. Ramps instead of steps, wider doorways, a workshop where Lila May could pursue the mechanical interests that had helped them survive their ordeal. It was still a sanctuary, but no longer a place of exile. "Letter from Helena," she said, holding up an official envelope bearing the territorial seal. "The governor wants to meet with us next month. Something about a formal commendation. Think we should go? I think we've earned the right to choose." She set the letter aside and reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of people who'd faced death together and chosen to build something new from the ashes. The world knows the truth now. That's what mattered. Through the valley below, they could see the smoke from Bitter Creek, the town that had slowly begun to reach out to them as news of their vindication spread. Visitors came now, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, even a few curious souls who simply wanted to meet the people who'd brought down one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in the Western Territories. But it was the small cairn of stones they'd built near the garden that drew Silas's attention most often. It marked no grave. Lila May's body had never been recovered from the mine collapse, but it served as a monument to Martha Hartwell and all the other victims of the Brennan conspiracy. Fresh wildflowers appeared there regularly, placed by hands that understood the weight of memory and the importance of honoring those who died seeking justice. She would have liked this place, Lila May said, following his gaze to the memorial. My mother always said the mountains were where God went when he wanted to think clearly. She was right about a lot of things. Silas pulled the silver ring from his pocket again, no longer examining it, but simply holding it like a talisman. Including you. You became exactly the woman she hoped you'd be. Strong enough to survive, but not so strong that I couldn't ask for help when I needed it. Lila May's smile carried warmth that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. That's what she wrote in her diary, that she hoped I'd find someone who could see past my limitations to the person I really was. The ring slid easily onto her finger when he offered it, fitting as perfectly as he'd hoped it would. There had been no formal ceremony, no official pronouncement, just two people who'd found in each other the completion they'd been seeking without knowing it. The marriage was as unconventional as everything else about their relationship, built on shared survival rather than romance, but stronger for being forged in crisis. Sheriff and Mrs. Crowley, she said, testing the sound of the words. Think it has a nice ring to it. Better than Brennan, anyway. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light play across the valley that had become their home. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled on mountain thermals, and Boone dozed in a patch of sunlight with the contentment of a creature who knew he was exactly where he belonged. The past hadn't been erased. It never could be. The guilt and pain and loss would always be part of their story. Scars that had healed but would never completely disappear. But they'd learned something that few people ever discover, that redemption doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from refusing to let it define the future. What do you think comes next? Lila May asked, her hand resting in his as they watched the sun begin its descent toward the western peaks. Whatever we choose, Silas replied, understanding finally that the choice itself was the greatest gift they'd been given. We've got time now. Time to build something good from what's left. In the distance, church bells began to ring in Bitter Creek, calling the faithful to evening services. The sound carried across the valley like a promise, reminding them that even in the wilderness, they were not alone. They were part of something larger now, a community, a story, a legacy that would outlive them both. As darkness settled over the Montana territory, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances sat together on their porch, planning a future that would honor both their past and their hard-won present. The mountains stood eternal around them, keeping their secrets and their promises with equal faithfulness. And in the growing darkness, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the whisper of wind through pine boughs, carrying the voices of those who'd gone before. Martha Hartwell and all the others, blessing the union of two souls who'd learned that love. Like justice, sometimes arrives wearing unexpected faces and speaking uncomfortable truths. The story was complete, but the life it had made possible was just beginning.